Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast for Cultural Reformation, a ministry of the Ezra Institute, where we equip current and emerging Christian cultural leaders with biblical worldview, Christian philosophy, and cultural apologetics studies. And we do this through residential training programs, through print and digital resources. I'm Dr. Michael Thiessen, together today with our president and founder, Dr. Joe Boot, and our fellow for Public Policy, Tim Dieppe. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. I'm excited to have this upcoming conversation.
Thank you. Great. Good to be with you.
Great to be back, Michael, from the sunny climes of southern Spain.
Don't you dare talk about Spain on this podcast. All right, everybody. We continue in our series today called Christianity and Politics, and we're going to be looking at the significance of Britain for the foundations of constitutional freedom. And, I think everybody jump into the comments. Americans, please give these two proud British men as hard a time as possible, for they are unashamed of their British colonialism. And so we really do want to have a great dialogue here. Of course, we've talked a number of times in this series about constitutionalism and the power of the beauty of covenantal law. And so we want to start back and learn about some of that history. And so, Tim, with you on our show, we'd love to have you just walk us through some of the major British documents, important moments in British history that really brought around, the language of human rights to the entire globe. So, Tim, what would be the importance and the significance of, say, the Magna Carta?
Yeah, well, Magna Carta is really historic and foundational. I think it was described by Lord Denning, who was Master of the Rolls back in 1956, as the greatest constitutional document of all times, the foundation of the freedom of the individual against the arbitrary authority of the despot. And it came about in 1215 originally. King John was behaving like a despot, basically, and a whole load of barons, and led by the Archbishop at the time, Archbishop Stephen Langton, came to him and said, you need to sign this document and promise to abide by these various things. And of course, it's a very Christian, very explicitly Christian document right from the outset, referencing God, referencing the church. And in fact, I'd like to read, if that's all right, the very first clause of the Magna Carta, because I think it's really significant. And this is one of those, there are I don't know, dozens of clauses here. I've got it in front of me. 60-something clauses. Clause 1, the very first one, the one they wanted to get in there first, it says first that we've granted to God and by this present charter have confirmed for us and our heirs in perpetuity that the English church shall be free and shall have its rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired. That we wish this so to be observed appears from the fact that our own free will, before the outbreak of the present dispute between us and our barons, we granted and confirmed by a charter the freedom of the church's elections, a right reckoned to be the greatest necessity and importance to it, and caused this to be confirmed by the Pope. This freedom we shall observe ourselves and desire to be observed in good faith by our heirs in perpetuity. To all free men of our kingdom, we've also granted for us and our heirs together all the liberties written out below, to have and to keep for them and their heirs of us and our heirs. And so you see there, a kind of like, insistence on the freedom of the church first. There is kind of like spear sovereignty before Kuiper, right? Before Abraham, as Joe would say. The church, leave out of that. That has its own government. That's doing its own thing. The state shouldn't interfere in what the church does. That's not the state's role. The state can do its own thing and set rules and stuff, but the church is free. The church is independent. The church gets to do its own thing and have its own regulations, its own jurisdiction. And like I said, this clause is still in force in our law today, 800 years later. And in fact, during the lockdown, when we launched a judicial review against the government for the closure of churches, it was absolutely key to that initial appeal for judicial review to reference Magna Carta and this very clause about that the church in England shall be free. Now, in the end, every time we kept bringing a court case against the British government, they opened up opened up the churches again, and then we couldn't go to court. But in Scotland, they kept the churches closed for longer, and so it got to court there. Magna Carta can't be referenced in Scotland because it's about the English church, so we had to use other constitutional arguments there. But the constitution there has also got very strong Christian foundations, and so the judge in Scotland actually ruled that closure of churches was a breach of both the constitution, which is effectively then going back to sphere sovereignty and freedom of the church, and a breach of human rights. So these enshrined things go back 800 years, and Magna Carta itself goes back and appeals really back to Anglo-Saxon legal codes before that, to Alfred the Great, the only king of Britain who has that title, Great, who was a very strong Christian king who set up a legal code prefaced by the Ten Commandments, so basically saying our laws come from this source, and these Old Testament laws and the Ten Commandments became sort of part of British law and the foundation of British law. And the barons and Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who sort of put together, in particular, the Magna Carta, were going back to that and wanting to go back to those kind of freedoms that Alfred the Great had put in place. And if you look at Magna Carta, you've got that freedom of the church right there in the very first clause. And then if you go skip down other clauses that still remain in force today, clause 38, no official shall place a man on trial upon his own unsupported statement without producing credible witness to the truth of it. So no trial without witnesses there. And clause 39, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. And so you see there a fundamental freedom or fundamental liberty. It doesn't use language of rights. It uses languages of liberty and freedom and people being free and having freedoms. And of course, we've now 800 years later moved very much onto rights, which I think is not a great thing, because it gives people this entitlement mentality. Much better to think about freedoms. And the British Constitution, sort of founded on this foundational document of Magna Carta, gives people freedoms, and basically the underlying assumption is that you are free to do whatever you want unless the law says otherwise. In contrast with other areas in Europe, I understand it's the other way around. You assume you can't do anything unless the law says you can do it. But it's much better to have it the British way around, where you assume you can do something unless the law says no. And that's kind of the fundamental foundational basis of Magna Carta, which predates the foundation of the United States of America by some few centuries, I think. There, Michael.
Yeah, and every American caught that little jab. That's good. This is fantastic as we delve into these things. I also love in the preamble of Magna Carta the very beginning sentence that know that before God, for the health of our soul and for those of our ancestors and heirs, to the honor of God and the exaltation of His holy church, and the better ordering of our kingdom. So many great purpose statements right there in the beginning of the preamble. Joe, the one thing I wanted to ask you, and then we're going to go back to Tim, about distinguishing between rights language and liberty language, because I think that's an important conversation to be had. But Joe, this is a declaration. This is a declaration that goes to basically claim these liberties from God. And, Joe, you've talked quite extensively on the idea of pre-political ideas, of pre-political freedoms. Can you expound on the fact that, the average person might be reading the Magna Carta and go, okay, well, yeah, of course they're giving lip service to God, of course they're they're leaning into that type of language, but they're not really basing all of these liberties on the existence and the freedoms that God actually gives, are they? I think this is so outer worldly for us to hear these words. So can you expound on them, like basically claiming these privileges from the Lord himself?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, in the 13th century, there really was no other way of looking at it. Monarchs saw their privileges and their authority as coming from God. The structure within the late Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, really the end of the tail end there, the high Middle Ages. That was the worldview of of Christendom. It was the worldview that shaped the life of the church, and so it's no surprise that they begin with statements about God and the freedom of the church. I have often said that the first truly free institution in history, as it emerged in the pagan world, was the Christian church that asserted its freedom under God in the first century. There was no, this, as Tim is absolutely right when he talks about the language of liberty and freedom being the language of the Bible and the language of Christian history. Because it was, as Peter says, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil. And the presupposition of Christianity is that under God alone is their freedom, and therefore his church is directly under God and is free from the control of the state. And I liked Tim's reference there to sphere sovereignty prior to Kuyper, because and certainly Kuyper would not have argued with that. He only saw himself as coining a phrase to summarize a belief that had been fundamental to the Western Church, that freedom is only under God and there are different spheres of authority. And those include the freedom of the individual person, which Magna Carta refers to in that right not to be incarcerated without due process. And the freedom of the church as the people of God. And of course, the English Revolution was then fought over the correct understanding of Magna Carta. I mean, basically, the Parliament was appealing again to Magna Carta. Magna Carta was, I think, some 40 times reiterated after 1215. So one of the interesting things about it was an era of charters, the era of the Magna Carta in Europe, but none of them really had the lasting value of Magna Carta, ones on the continent that the Magna Carta did in asserting the freedom of individuals and the freedom of the church, and of course that provides for freedom of conscience and liberty. And I'll be interested to hear what Tim has to say about this important difference that he's highlighted, which is so absolutely critical. This language of human rights that has developed, kind of, these are given by fiat, by the state, by some, collection of elites get together and say, what should we say people's rights are? And then they assert them. We saw the value of that with the Canadian Charter during the lockdown period. And I think that's a brilliant contrast, actually, because Tim referred to the legal cases, both that were planned in England and then the one that happened in Scotland, where it was the lockdown of the church was found to be unconstitutional, where in Canada the absolute opposite was found to be the case, where our fundamental freedoms, so-called, which were arrived at by fiat, in the second part of the charter, right, Michael? The what do we call it in Canada? I've only been out of the country 2 years and I've forgotten. So we've got we have the fundamental freedoms that are basically Section 2 freedoms are caveated by Section 1 freedoms, and actually, when Magna Carta that is then applied by contrast in England in an unwritten constitutional context, the freedom of the church is agreed by the courts in Scotland, even in the 21st century. So you see the lasting, it was, as I say, reiterated some 40 times. The Magna Carta becomes the foundation of freedom of conscience, trial by jury, and critically, the rule of law, that the king himself, everyone, king and commoner, are subject to the law. And that's the foundation of freedom. Freedom is only under God. And so, yeah, Tim's right. We speak as Christians of liberties and freedoms, not rights. And the Ten Commandments, when you look at them, they're basically, the Decalogue is framed negatively. So basically, God is saying all of life is freedom. You are free. Here's the things you can't do. If it's not there, you're free. Here's the things you can't do. And I think it was G.K. Chesterton who famously said, if you don't live by the 10 commandments, you'll live by the 10,000 commandments. And I think that's the difference between the language of liberty and the negative framing of the 10 commandments and the language of rights, where basically now the government is increasingly have to legislate that you be nice to people. To legislate that this is how all of your behavior, how you're going to think, how you're going to behave, how you're going to act. It's getting to the point where we're talking about legislation that would make people be polite and kind to other people at work. This is becoming utterly absurd. But this is the core difference. I've said enough. I want to bring Tim back in. Michael, back to you.
Yeah, and as we explore this difference between rights and freedoms, of course, we know that a modern development is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as it was drafted, any reference to God was taken out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you have in no version from its earliest versions does it tie the rights of an individual or the freedoms of an individual to religion or the existence of God, which is the opposite of what we saw in Magna Carta. And I know, Tim, you want to talk about the coronation oath at the same time about this. So I think that one of the areas I want to explore as we go forward is this idea of assertion. Joe, you've said the church asserts, and then, of course, the Magna Carta asserts. It's interesting. I think we are so used to a consensus, soft social science. Let's explore this idea that the concept of asserting these things in the name of God is difficult for people to grasp. But that's exactly how these freedoms were birthed in the United Kingdom. Tim, why don't we go over to you and let's hear about the coronation oath and keep exploring the difference between rights and freedoms.
Just Michael, just carrying on those sort of freedom aspect there versus rights aspect. You're quite right to highlight the issues, and Joe's also highlighted some of the stuff around that. But it becomes a problem once you assert rights. It changes the mentality, as I was trying to say. The mentality is entitlement rather than a mentality of duty or a mentality of responsibility. And that's a problem. We have a very entitlement-oriented society or culture in contemporary culture, and people are constantly taught about their rights. And it's unhealthy for society to keep thinking about, I'm entitled to this, I'm entitled, your government owes me this, people owe me that, everyone owes me something else. And of course, here in the UK, we have adopted into law the European Convention of Human Rights, which is very similar to the UN Convention, which you mentioned. And it's now a big debate because it's been overused and overextended. And you've got convicted criminals and terrorists that we can't deport back to their country of origin because, it's breaching their human rights. Well, that's a crazy situation to be in. And so, we've now got currently a selection of the next Conservative Party leader, who could be the next Prime Minister, who knows. And Robert Jenrick, one of the contenders there, is arguing we must leave the European Convention of Human Rights, and Kemi Badenoch is saying we must not leave the European Convention of Human Rights. And so that's one of the big differences between the two of them. And that is what people are voting on and thinking about right now in the Conservative Party. And I personally think we should leave. I think it's crazy to have these supranational sort of institutional system that overrides our parliamentary will to decide who we can and who we can't have in the country. And I think we've just got to leave it and let Parliament decide and rule the law, and not have to be subservient to a charter that comes from outside and is interpreted by foreign judges. I think that's clearly not how it should be. So my vote is to leave it. But that's sort of a bit more on those rights things. But the Christian foundation of our society was highlighted again very, very strongly at the coronation last year of King Charles. And the Queen sadly died the year before in 2022. And it's very, very striking. You had millions of people all over the world watching this coronation, and the words in that coronation oath very, very explicitly Christian. In fact, even before the coronation, King Charles had to make the Scottish oath. We talked about Scotland earlier, and the Queen died on the 8th of September 2022, and on the 10th of September, he had to swear before the Privy Council and say that I, Charles III, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of my other realms and territories, King, Defender of the Faith, do faithfully promise and swear that I shall inviolably maintain and preserve the settlement of the true Protestant religion as established by the laws of Scotland, in prosecution of the claim of right, and particularly the act entitled Act for Securing the Protestant Religion and Presbyterian Church Government, and by the acts passed in both kingdoms for the union of two kingdoms, together with government, worship, discipline, rights and privileges of the Church of Scotland. So help me God. You see how explicitly Protestant and Christian those words are. I watched that live on the BBC, and of course the BBC commentator couldn't resist saying, "Of course, these words mean nothing," as if they originally meant nothing. And these words actually do still mean something, as proven by the Magna Carta, still means something in law today. And then when you got to the coronation itself, you had the Bible presented to the king, and in the midst of all of the crown jewels and regalia and all of that, they present him with a Bible, and they said to him in front of all the cameras and everything, "Sir, to keep you ever mindful of the law and the gospel of God as the rule for the whole life and government of Christian princes, receive this book, the most valuable thing that this world affords. Here is wisdom. This is the royal law. These are the lively oracles of God." Very striking. The most valuable thing, forget the crown jewels, forget all the other symbols and so on. The most valuable thing, the word of God. It's the lively oracles of God. Very, very explicitly Christian. As a nation, what we valued most of everything in the universe was the word of God. And that's a remarkable, incredible thing to sort of say and to witness, and even today to still witness to the nation that was where we stood. Now, I think we've fallen a long way from that, but it's still a very interesting thing to have. And then, later on, he promised to, again, similar to that Scottish oath again, preserve the Protestant Reformed religion established by law and the settlement of the Church of England, the doctrine, worship, discipline, and government thereof as by law established in England, and the rights and privileges of the church, and all of that is in there. So very explicitly Christian, still stands as part of our law today. The words still recited, even if people don't understand or don't appreciate their meaning or try and dismiss their meaning, still very much there. And so you can see that Christianity influenced our whole political system so massively, so strongly, and it's still in there today, even as we become a more and more secular anti-Christian culture. The pervading influence of that, which was intended to sort of last for generations and in perpetuity, as Magna Carta said, is still there in our legal system.
Yeah, it's interesting, Tim, how you observed that the commentator couldn't help but say this means nothing when the entire historical development was founded on the fact that it did mean something. And
Exactly.
It goes back to even when we read the Magna Carta and we go, how is there legitimate sincerity in this? And there was, and of course the success of the Commonwealth has been built on the sincerity of those words. Joe, what happens to a country? So there's this rich history, and we're trying to suggest a solution for all commonwealths, all constitutional governments. And what happens if this declaration about the holy word of God is just lip service, versus what's the potential if we, the church, could help our nation repent and understand the weightiness and the substance of those words? What's the difference between the direction of those two ways?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the English constitutional arrangements, the British constitutional arrangements, if we include Scotland as well in that, are indicative of a covenantal view of history, which I think speaks directly to that question. And this too was recognized in the United States when the president took the oath of office. Historically, of course, we know that the president takes his oath of office on a Bible, but he historically took it on an open Bible to Deuteronomy 28, invoking the blessings and cursings of God's law upon the nation. And in the Cromwellian period, in the period of the Revolution in England, there was something called the Solemn League and Covenant, which Parliament had signed. And actually, the Solemn League and Covenant was ratified by Charles II as well, even after the Cromwellian protectorate had ended in England. And this is all part of these covenants, these oaths are all part of the same basic worldview. The Coronation Oath, really, its history goes all the way back to King Solomon. I mean, that's where they get it from. The first Pentecost, actually, in the Bible is a civic Pentecost, when the Spirit comes upon the 70 elders who are governing to govern the people. There's a recognition that civil authority requires anointing. And we enter the era of the kings, and it's not men who elect and appoint such people. It's God who calls people to that office and places them under his law. And so when Tim was talking about the elements of the coronation service, and they are really worth reading. There is actually a short section in my book, Mission of God, which I know many of our listeners are familiar with, from about page 253 in the current edition, where I discuss the Coronation Oath and its significance. And this is one of the differences between actually the US Constitution and Britain, is that the UK explicitly is Christian. It invokes the Lordship of Christ. It invokes the Kingship of Christ. It makes a specific oath to evangelical faith, basically, to the Protestant religion. It makes its fundamental commitment to the law of God. And as we've seen, that goes back to King Alfred and the early Anglo-Saxon codes and to the Ten Commandments themselves. And it all hangs together. So, you think about Alfred the Great, and then you think about the Coronation Oath, and even right now, the modern Coronation Oath that Tim just talked about with Charles. There's this continuity there that connects us right back to the law of God and being under God and making our oaths before God. Now, I don't know which BBC commentator it was, because I wasn't watching that at the time. I actually arrived back in England just before the Queen's death, but I wasn't watching the BBC that day, and I don't know whether that was Hugh Edwards, who's covered himself in shame since then, who said doesn't mean anything.
It could well have been. I don't know. It could well have been. I have to check that. I don't know.
Yeah, so I don't know either. But the reality is that whether we take seriously the oath or not, God does. God isn't mocked. And I think that's the question you're asking ultimately, Michael. When you go and get married and you make an oath before God, you may have your, in spiritually speaking, your fingers crossed, and be holding that marriage oath with some degree of contempt. Well, if it works, whatever. But God takes it seriously. And when a country enters into an oath before God, whether it's a Solemn League and Covenant or the Coronation Oath, God takes that seriously. So you may think you're participating in pantomime, but God is the one who says, who hears everything, who sees everything, and who says, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." That God takes our oaths seriously. And actually, we used to recognize that. In fact, to a degree, we still do in the courts, because we take perjury very seriously, and we still make people swear on something considered to be above them when they make an oath. So Tim may correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think for the most part, people are still required to swear on Scripture when they make an oath. When I took the
Well, we
oath
just
of,
had the swearing in Parliament, Joe, and for the first time, I think a minority of MPs actually swore on the Bible. I think that was the first time ever that that's happened in British history. Or at least it was the most secular Parliament. I can't, and so the highest portion didn't swear on the Bible. They have various other options. They can swear on various other things. One of the MPs was actually told off for not, for sort of saying I do this under resistance or something, and had to do it again, showing complete disregard for it. I think the Bible is still the most commonly used book, but people do swear on various other books or can just affirm it as well, and the same in court as well, of course.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's particularly interesting because, of course, this is in the UK. For those who don't know, this is a Labour government, so there was a big swing in seats. So I'm not surprised that it was the most sort of secular. But it's interesting that you see there we're still using the Bible. We've still got that memory of swearing on something above us. And so, Michael, I think fundamentally, when we make an oath and then we abuse that oath,
So 40% of the MPs chose to take a secular affirmation instead of a religious oath to God,
right.
up from 24% last time. That includes the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and 50% of the cabinet.
Yeah, yeah. So that illustrates the significant religious shift, and I think that's actually part of God's covenantal judgments on our nation for not taking our oaths seriously. So when a nation is obedient to God, obeys His law, and takes its oath to God seriously, God's blessing comes, and when we don't, God's curses come. And if you look at really the greatest century for Britain, really was the 19th century, the Victorian age. It was the period, as William Wilberforce pointed out. He said, if we don't deal with this issue of slavery, God isn't going to bless us. If we address it, we'll be blessed as a nation. We entered upon the greatest century in British history in terms of wealth, power, global influence, and the sending of missionaries around the world. And that's the fruit of faithfulness. And of course, now we're in a very different kind of time when we're experiencing the judgments of God. So we do need to take these oaths seriously. It may be treated like pantomime, but God doesn't certainly treat it that way.
And as we have this conversation about Christianity and politics, we have this particular conversation. Joe, you brought up the illustration of marriage. And that's fairly obvious for Christians, where they would think about that quite naturally. Of course, I'm going to get married. I'm going to get married in a church. I'm going to take my vows before God. And it's just one of these areas where we're very negligent into the sphere of politics, where we don't realize the importance of bringing the presence of God into those political avenues, and asserting, as Joe, you've used that word a number of times correctly, asserting the word of God and the law of God, so that politicians rule in accordance with vows before God. Very, very similar to marriage, and it's quite an important conversation that Christians need to get over. Tim, in our current climate, and you saw there, you just typed in and did the stats of individuals who are making secular statements. As we're seeing this secular shift, this humanist shift in culture, how does your work in the UK try to call back members of parliament to uphold these historic oaths to God?
Well, a number of ways we do that, and we're trying to really be a prophetic voice, as the church generally should be, a prophetic voice to the culture, and a prophetic voice to Parliament, calling it to serve God, calling it to honour God and obey God's laws, as all nations should. And we do that by going in the media and writing to MPs, as we'll be doing very shortly, about, currently there's a big debate in the UK about legalizing assisted suicide. I know you've got it in Canada, had it for Canada, and we're constantly using statistics and examples from Canada to say, don't go there, please don't do that, don't follow Canada. So thank you for your example on that. But we're calling MPs, don't do this, and a lot of pressure is put on us to not to talk about God, don't mention how life is sacred and stuff. But we don't shy away from doing that. Life is sacred. That is the truth. We're going to say it anyway. And that is one reason why not to legalise assisted suicide. And we're very pleased because it was debated in the Welsh Parliament, Senedd, which doesn't have authority to actually change the law, but is an indicative thing, and it actually did lose the vote. So, in other words, they voted not to try and ask Parliament to legalise assisted suicide. So the debate will come up in here in the end of November. But we also, of course, go to the courts, and the example I already cited is a great example of that, of saying, no, you can't just close the churches, that's against the law. And the Scottish judge saying, actually, yes, you're right, it is against both the Constitution and human rights. And so, and we challenge the courts in lots of different ways on these kind of things. Street preachers get arrested for saying something somebody says is offensive. All they're doing is quoting the Bible. We go to court and get them cleared, sometimes get compensation from the police for them, and so on. And that's a way of calling them back to what the law should be, which is they are free to express. People are free to express what they think, and also Christians who run in some of the workplace for saying what they think as well. We're often going to the courts defending them as well and calling them back to, hang on, the laws say we should be allowed to just say what we think and stuff. And we have a lot of victories. Not everyone's a victory. We have a lot of victories in the mix of all that. And even if we don't win, we still highlight in the media the issues and challenge politicians and challenge the culture about, should it really be that people should be arrested for expressing their thoughts and for expressing what they think and so on. But the culture is turning away from God at the moment, and it is becoming more challenging. And that's that indicative thing about the MPs not swearing on the Bible is a very striking way in which the Parliament shifted in this last election.
Tim, you mentioned that you're advised not to bring God into your strategy. And this is a very common piece of advice that we receive. So, here in the United States, people would call, Republicans who are like that, they would call them squishes, or they'd call them rhinos. You have in Canada, you have a conservative party that is really conservative in name only, and often emptied of any ability to push back from the progressivism that's going on. And yet the same old political advice comes forward, even within a room full of lawyers. So 2 questions. What do you say to the individual who says it's more practical you'll have more success if you can just, have the same dialogue, but don't be so overtly Christian? And then the person who would look, maybe some of our American friends who would be listening, or Canadian friends who would be listening, who would say, look, like Christianity just should not be instituted at such a high level because governments are corrupt, and then they corrupt the good laws of God through their corruption. Those are 2 things that I hear quite regularly as we have this dialogue. So first, it's not practical to be so overtly Christian. And then secondly,
we're talking really about, in a sense, Michael, about co-belligerence. And, we very often do things on our own and as Christians concerned and run our own legal cases and don't look to other people to help us or aid us or support us, and apart from our own supporters, to fund and help what we do. But sometimes it's worth engaging in co-belligerence with other organizations where we share a common interest. Assisted suicide is one of those areas where there are lots of groups from lots of other different religions and no religion who are very strongly opposed to assisted suicide, and it can be worth collaborating with them to a point. But when the point comes, whatever you do, don't mention God at all. Then we'll probably say that's not for us, or we'll reserve the right to continue to mention God, at least in our own things or something like that. Because ultimately, the question is, where are you pointing to for your source of morals? If you're pointing to human rights or something else, you're basically deifying that code and saying that is ultimately the arbiter of what's right and wrong. And so you need to call people back to God. You need to call people back to, if you can't appeal to God, all you're appealing to is the state, is the other way of looking at it. It's kind of statism. So you must appeal to God. You must be able to go back to God. The fact is, there is a God. We are accountable to him as individuals and as nations. And we need to be able to call people to that and bring that into their attention and bring that into the dialogue as well, unashamedly, even if people criticize us, ridicule us, say you're going to put people off, whatever. It will also still hit people's consciences, because people at the end of the day do know in their hearts that there is a creator God.
Tim, you mentioned earlier, and Joe, I want to direct this question to you. You mentioned earlier needing to step outside of a broader human rights movement, that maybe the European human rights movement or the UN. Joe, is that a major problem for the Brits? This the sovereignty of its own parliament, as you just continue to live within this globalist push?
Yeah, I mean, the whole issue of Brexit, a few years ago, a lot of people didn't really fully understand what that was really about. And a lot of people reduce it to sort of pragmatic questions about, freedom of movement and various other sort of, well, maybe sociological issues. But actually, there was a real fundamental for me, and I wrote a lengthy article about it at the time, a real religious and philosophical foundational question there. And that does have to do with the sovereignty of nation states. As Tim has said, the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, has basically been a sort of a kangaroo court of judges that aren't accountable to anybody in Britain, unelected by us, who are governing who can come and go out of our own country. And so, foreign judges, indeed, yeah. So that's a major problem. Go ahead, Michael.
Just as a follow up, Tim, can you give us some examples of decisions that European court can make on British citizens with absolutely no accountability to Parliament?
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, famously, Sunak introduced the idea of initially deporting illegal immigrants to Rwanda, and every time they tried to get some people on a flight, lawyers jumped on and said it's breach of their human rights, and they couldn't take off. They got an injunction, and they never managed to get them taken off. Rishi Sunak. And that just, the government had voted to do that, Parliament had voted to do that, MPs voted to do it, but the European Court of Human Rights said no, and therefore Parliament was blocked in its aims. As I said, that's the most famous, most recent example that has happened on this. We've had many other examples of individuals as terrorists, convicted terrorists, who we wanted to reinstate back to their country of origin, and it's been deemed a breach of their human rights to do that, even though they're a convicted terrorist here, and we should not be forced to keep them here in this country. So those are the most egregious examples of where that court has ruled against the clear expressed wish of our Parliament, and overridden it without electoral accountability or other accountability at all.
Yeah. Okay, and we really should have left the ECHR with Brexit. And I think a lot of British people are very frustrated with the fact that what they thought they had voted for with Brexit, the bureaucracy, what in America we would call the deep state, the civil service has just endlessly and perpetually resisted what was really voted for there. And certainly there would be those that would argue right now, Jenrick probably included in that now, and certainly Nigel Farage, leader of the Reform Party, that really this should have been that this was the implication of Brexit, that there should have been the return of this kind of national sovereignty. The thing that it's probably worth coming to as we try to do with all of these episodes, Michael, as well, is to talk a little bit about some of what might be some of the criticisms of the English constitutional arrangements, the arrangements in the UK, and Tim probably be able to add some light and shade to our understanding of this. One of them would of course be the church-state issue, because of course for Americans who are listening, they know that, or many will know that there is a soft establishment in England of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And at the federal level, at least in the United States, there's no established church. They wanted to ensure that there was freedom of the states to go their own way. Some states did establish churches in the early constitutional period. Others didn't. After 1688 and the Glorious Revolution, of course, steadily much more room was made for nonconformity. And so there has been complete freedom for the non-established churches for a very long time in England. Nonetheless, there's been a privileged position for the Church of England because of bishops in the House of Lords. But Tim, it's often misunderstood when people think about the Church of England. The king is the titular head of the church, but he's not allowed to function as a priest. He can't administer communion or preach the word of God. And actually, even the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury has very much a civil involvement of Parliament again. I mean, there's involvement of MPs in the approval.
There used to be, Joe. There used to be. Gordon Brown actually got rid of that. Gordon Brown was the last Prime Minister to be able to pick between two candidates to be Archbishop or to be Bishop, and he said, "I'm getting rid of this. I don't think I should have a view in it." So he didn't do that. But prior to that, previous Prime Ministers, Margaret Thatcher famously, did choose, or they're presented with two names, and they have to decide which one to become the bishop. And Margaret Thatcher certainly took that kind of thing very seriously. Others may not have done. And Gordon Brown, as a Christian himself, I think actually thought that he shouldn't be having a say in this, and so dropped it. So that doesn't happen anymore, but it did used to for many hundreds of years. Yes, you say,
yeah. So even with those sort of slight variations, it's an interesting and unusual situation for Canadians and Americans to think about those kinds of relationships. And I would argue that although there is a sort of structural interlacement between church and state in England, there isn't a conflation of sphere sovereignty, because the jurisdictions of church and state are very clearly delineated. But how would you help people to understand that? And do you think, is this, I mean, you may think, well, is there, it may not be ideal, is there a problem with the church-state relationship? Obviously, when the church is strong and being faithful, it seems like less of a problem. Right now, we've got an Archbishop of Canterbury who's just said that, gay sex is not sinful. So, and that's the leader of the supposedly the most senior bishop. So what's your take on that?
Joe, I think in theory it's a very good system, actually, because if you didn't have the establishment of the Church of England, you wouldn't have that coronation oath like that as part of our constitution. You wouldn't have that witness to the Christian religion. You wouldn't have basically identifying ourselves as a Christian country in law, and something like Magna Carta still being part of our constitution and the freedom of the church, and so on. So I respect the American system of separation of church and state, although I think they can take it too far, because surely the church should have some influence in the state, and surely a Christian state would want to identify as a Christian state and say it's Christian. And that's basically the status of the constitution in Britain, that we do identify constitutionally as a Christian state, and we have an established Protestant Reformed church, as doctrinally stated in the Articles and the 39 Articles, which are not being changed, and the doctrine remains very much a Protestant Reformed religion in our constitution. And Church of England ministers have special legal rights by virtue of that, which is a great aid to the gospel if they're so minded, in terms of access and ability and a parish and all of these other things. But of course, as you say, here we are, And we talk about words losing their meaning earlier. And, you've had the Archbishop of Canterbury say, basically, I openly is now saying, I don't agree with Church of England doctrine. Don't worry about it. I'm sincere. Therefore, that's all fine. At least I'm sincere about it. But how can this be that you have an Archbishop of Canterbury who's openly saying, I disagree with the doctrine, I don't care about the words anymore? And this is, our very postmodern society that he's able to say that unashamedly, and obviously with the support of the Archbishop of York and various other bishops as well, who are just openly heretical, openly disbelieving and disagreeing with those doctrines in there, not bothering to change them, just saying, oh, well, at least I'm sincere, so it's okay. But it really isn't okay. And so, once you have an apostate church thing, which is very close to where we are now, if not where we are already now, then arguably it could be the case that, having the established church in that way is actually damaging for the society and bad for the society, even though in terms of the actual words and the text, which nobody thought could just be overridden like that and just disregarded like that, it is actually, I think, a good system.
Well, I think it's just an illustration, really, isn't it? That no constitutional system is perfect, and that in the end, no constitutional system, if the faith of the people evaporates, can guarantee the Christian status of the nation. I happen to agree with you, Tim. I'm glad you put it the way that you did. I agree that actually the historically the establishment of the church has been a net positive. And I see a structural interlacement without a violation of sphere sovereignty in the British constitutional arrangements. But it's nice to hear you repeat that. And it just goes to show whether you're an American and you've got your separation of church and state structure and the US Constitution, or you've got the British Constitution, if the faith of the people evaporates, your political arrangements will not save you. It has to be, at the end of the day, the religious route. Now, I appreciate Michael just giving me a moment here just to come back on a couple of things. Because I wanted to just tease out one or two other potential criticisms. So we've addressed one there, I think, well. The other one, Tim, I hope it's not too arcane, but Parliament in Britain claims sovereignty, absolute sovereignty. The US Constitution doesn't use the word sovereignty about human government. And basically, Parliament can make any law, and that's law, and that's it. Parliament is sovereign. Now, some people would read that and say, well, is that usurping the sovereignty of God? Or would you say that because the Parliament is the King's Parliament or the Queen's Parliament, it is the Parliament is invited, a government is invited, I should say, to serve at the monarch's request, and because the monarch is sworn to uphold the law and gospel, which affirms the absolute sovereignty of God, do we have there a sort of check and balance? Do you think that the sovereignty of Parliament, as it's been understood or formulated, is excessive? Does it go beyond what the Bible would prescribe for a legislature? Or do you think that the English constitutional arrangement with the King and the coronation...
I think the constitutional arrangement as it was clearly expressed as sovereignty under God. And under God's laws and subject to God. There's no pretense at being divine, no pretense at being anything other than coming under God and under God's jurisdiction. And the law applies equally to all people and the foundation of law. And for many, many centuries, people said Christianity was part and parcel of the law. And the law was clearly understood to be based on biblical law. And you could refer to the Bible in order to help understand the law. So I think it was a good system. In terms of that, and I think now we've basically lost that, and people don't refer to that anymore. And judges say the opposite. Judges will say we are no longer a Christian nation, and we should not assume Christianity, assume that as part of the state. And we have lawyers arguing that quoting the Bible should be an offence in Britain. That the very same Bible that was declared to be the most valuable thing the world affords in the coronation service last year. The very same Bible is what our lawyers are arguing should be an offence to, or actually somebody was convicted of quoting a Bible verse, displaying a Bible verse outside an abortion clinic. earlier this year, convicted just of displaying a verse of the Bible, Psalm 139, knit together in my mother's womb. So yes, if I answer your question, Joe, I think it was a good safeguard. I don't think it is now necessarily, but that's like to your point that no system can safeguard against the evils of the human heart at the end of the day.
One last potential criticism before I sort of pitch this back to Michael of the constitutional arrangements in the UK. And this would be slightly different now in terms of the way I would frame the problem. In Britain, you had the House of Commons, you still have a House of Commons, and you have the House of Lords. And the basic idea of this is that you wouldn't have the direct democracy mob rule of France, of the French revolutionaries, but you would have a balance between commons, the common people, and restraining the sort of temptation to mob rule. You'd have hereditary peers and bishops in the House of Lords that would be able to push legislation back to Parliament for reconsideration if it was felt that it was losing its way, that it was inappropriate. Of course, with the radical sort of egalitarian view of society that we have now, the whole idea of hereditary peers or bishops being able to have a say on these things is sort of laughed at. And the Labour Party in the early part of the 21st century began a massive sort of revamp of the House of Lords by making it a place for political appointees and handing out peerages to their buddies and so on, and that sort of continued. Do you think that the original purpose of a two-part question really was the original purpose of Lords and Commons Christian in its basis? Was it a good idea to have bishops and hereditary peers as this counterweight? And do you think now that the House of Lords has kind of, now that it's become what it's become, is it really fit for purpose? I mean, does it really function in the way that an upper chamber was supposed to function? I mean, have we now, might as we well now have just a parliament and a senate like Canada? Because, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think it did. I think it was a healthy check and balance here. I think it was to have one elected chamber where you have like career politicians effectively, and that's what they are. And there's something admirable about people wanting to serve in that kind of way, but there's also, you do attract people who are particularly ambitious and have particular political ambitions and particular political agendas into that, and to have another legislator that is not career politicians. And that is people who have proved themselves to society in some other way or other, and are not, politics has not been their whole career, not their whole job for life, and who bring a wealth of experience from industry, law, hereditary as it was, but various other professions as well, into this chamber, and acts as a check and balance in terms of a wide variety of people with a wide variety of experiences into there to sort of provide some counterbalance to politics that's swayed one week to the next, or one parliament to the next. As we've just seen a massive swing from Conservative to Labour. Previously there's a massive swing towards Conservatives, and things swing one way to another, whereas the House of Lords doesn't swing like that because it's not voted on like that. And therefore, there's an element of stability in there that acts as, I think, would have been a healthy check and balance. And then having bishops specifically given voices, I think it's 12 seats in the House of Lords, as it was, with bishops who would have believed the doctrine of the Church of England stuff, giving them a particular position to have a prophetic voice into Parliament in that kind of way, not in the elected chamber, in the unelected chamber, I think was a helpful thing, and was a good thing, and you would have respected it as a Christian, thought it's a good thing to do. Of course, now the bishops would argue for legalizing or criminalizing conversion therapy and things like that, and have failed to stand up on abortion rights and things like that as well, or against abortion rights, I mean, of course. So one can question the value of having the bishops in there now as a faithful Christian. But originally set up with the bishops who believed their 39 articles and so on, you would have said, yes, this is a good thing. Let's have it. Let's keep them in there. So yes, I think it was a good check and balance, and I think to a degree it still is, Joe, because again, they're still not career politicians. I mean, some of them do. Former prime ministers and former ministers do end up in the House of Lords, but most of them are not career politicians in there, and I think a lot of them have varying expertise and so on that really adds a good, healthy check and balance. And I think it'd be a shame to make it an elected chamber, as some people are proposing we should do.
So it's interesting. We tend to go over similar themes sometimes when we're having these conversations, and of course, everybody. One of the major messages you need to hear is that we Christians are to be faithful to our Lord. We are to faithfully proclaim His reign and rule over all of life, and so we influence. We've heard that word. We need to influence the political sphere. Just to bring the conversation full circle, gentlemen, the Magna Carta was including one of its criticisms and one of its assertions was dealing with the practice of investiture, and so we have always wrestled with this tension between the influence of the church and then the freedom of the church, where the state would want to control the church. And so even if we're talking about the British system or we're thinking about the American context, it boils back to calling the nation to faith and to walk under Christ so that His law can bless the church and the citizens with freedom. And so this is a very important conversation. And as I think you've heard, listener, in this, I think you've heard the subtle change of religion going on. And of course, we need to fight back that change of religion by proclaiming the gospel and proclaiming the greatness of our God. So this has, of course, been encouraging, even though we've explored some of the similar foundations that we go back to. And this is why it's important. We have to re-go over some of these things because of how important it is to press forward with a clear vision. So everybody, we've got a number of events I want to share with you. And here are a few things coming up. Coming up really almost immediately in the UK. I think you guys are at an event this weekend. Mission of God UK is this weekend, is it not?
Yep.
So if you're a UK listener and you haven't got your ticket yet, get out right now. Go to the website, EzraInstitute.com, and buy your ticket. We have 2 Canadian Mission of God conferences coming up in late November and December. And then we have a Mission of God Denver coming up in January. So these are one-day conferences where you can come and delve into similar topics like this, even though we're going to be focused on specific subject matter. And then coming up in the spring is ReformCon. And I just want to get the dates out here for you. We're going to bring them up in front of you. And we just want to remind you that the title of the weekend is going to be Out of the Ashes. And this is, of course, in a partnership with Apologia Ministries. And so ReformCon 2025 comes on April 24th to 26th. It's going to be in Tucson, Arizona. And it's going to be a great time. So we would really appreciate you coming and joining us to, again, explore all of these important conversations to the glory of God. So Joe, as we wrap up, do you have any further comments that you want to add just as we close off the show?
Well, I'm very tempted to say Rule Britannia and Land of Hope and Glory and give you a good rendition of it. But I think I should really end just by saying, as you've said, Michael, in the end, all of this, as we think about Christianity and politics, is about the lordship and the rule and reign of Christ, and how we as human beings seek to respond in our construction of political life in terms of God's ordinances, in terms of God's norms, how we need to do that faithfully. And in every era and in various cultural contexts, it's not always going to look identical. The structural arrangement may not look identical, but it needs to embody the same core commitment that Jesus Christ is Lord and King of all, that we are free in him, that he reigns over all, his law governs, and that all men and nations need to bow and acknowledge the lordship and kingship of Jesus Christ in their political arrangements and structures. And so whether we're in Britain or America or Canada or beyond, in other nations of the world that are listening, the key is that we honor in our constitutional arrangements the lordship of Christ and the authority of his law word.
That's so important. And as we close off, we want to thank Tim for being on the show with us. Tim, thank you so much for all of your comments and your example of leading as a Christian in public life. And we want to remind you, our listeners, that from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen.